Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's program on ASM's Endowment Lecture Series, The Anarchy, the East India Company, Corporate Violence and the Pillage of the Empire, and by Dr. William Dalrymple. I request everyone to mute their audio and stop their video for better connectivity. Over to you, Winnell.
Good evening. On behalf of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you for the 10th Professor Dhirendra Narain Endowment Lecture. I'm Meenal Shirsagar, Chairperson of the Endowment Lectures Committee. We are excited and honored that two titans are with us today. We have the privilege of having the celebrated author and historian William Dalrymple addressing us, and the legendary Professor Dr. N Goswamy, the leading art historian and art critic, chairing this session. Thank you, distinguished scholars, for accepting our invitation. We really appreciate your being with us today. Mr. Dalrymple, we are delighted that you will be sharing some of your groundbreaking research on the early colonial history of India that is rivetingly portrayed in your book, The Anarchy, the East India Company, Corporate Violence, and the Pillage of an Empire. Here, if you don't mind, I would like to quote just a few sentences from your book. Under Jones and Hastings, the Asiatic Society became the catalyst for an outpouring of scholarship on the civilization of what Jones called this wonderful country. It formed enduring relations with the Bengali intelligentsia and led the way to uncovering the deepest roots of Indian history and civilization. In India, Jones wrote that he had found Arcadia. It was a moment rare in the history of empire, of genuine cross-cultural appreciation. I suspect that William Dalrymple shares a love for India in common with his protagonist, Hastings, for whom India was his Arcadia. Before I hand over the proceedings to Professor Goswami, kindly permit me to introduce the Endowmental Speakers for today. Today's lecture is the 10th Endowment Lecture in the memory of Professor Dhirendra Narain of the Department of Sociology, University of Mumbai. He was a guru in the true sense of the word. He was irreplaceable as an academic and was loved and respected not only by his students, but also by his colleagues and friends. When he was a lecturer, reader, and later professor in the Department of Sociology, he taught subjects such as the sociology of knowledge that had been studied by very few. His lectures made a great impact on all his students. While writing about him, his friend Dr. R. Srinivasan has remembered and mentioned an international symposium on modernization conceived and organized by Professor Narain. He says that it was an international gathering of great distinction, and for many decades, nothing similar had been attempted in the social sciences. Professor Narain retired in 1991 as head of the famed Department of Sociology. His first book, Hindu Character, was a masterpiece. The memorial volume of essays on Professor Kapadia and the masterly assessment of Professor Gurier was regarded as his scholarly tribute to his teachers. The Dr. G.D. Parikh volume was edited and published jointly by Dr. Narain and Dr. S.H. Deshpande in 1979. We are thankful to Dr. Vatsala Narain, his wife and fellow sociologist, for making a generous donation to the Asiatic Society in order to institute this endowment. William Dalrymple is a gifted historian, well respected by his peers. He has a formidable fan following among the reading public. In keeping with the time-honored tradition of many Scottish families, he went off to India in 1984 after completing his brilliant scholastic career, culminating with his becoming a senior history scholar at Trinity College, Cambridge. His interests include the history of and art of the areas that were of interest to the British Indian Empire, which covered India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Middle East, and the religions, including Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and early Eastern Christianity. He has published many books and learned papers and contributed to leading and prestigious periodicals and newspapers. He has also been eminently successful as a TV and radio writer and presenter. Dalrymple, the best-selling author of the Wolfson Prize-winning White Mughals, The Last Mughal, which won the Duff Cooper Prize, and the Hemingway and Kapuscinski Prize-winning Return of a King. In 2018, he was presented with the prestigious President's Medal by the British Academy for his outstanding literary achievement and for co-founding the Jaipur Literature Festival, which has become the world's largest festival for writers. He was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers for 2020 by Prospect. His latest book, The Anarchy, is a critically acclaimed global bestseller. It was selected as one of Barack Obama's best books of 2019 and named the Times History Book of the Year. Suffice it to say that he is a person who has brought Indian history to life across the world and enabled not just the scholar, but also the layperson to delve into his ever-increasing trove of treasures. Thank you, Mr. Dalrymple.
Thank you very much.
Professor Dr. N Goswamy is a legend and known all over the world as the leading Indian art critic and art historian. When he retired from his academic career, Punjab University made him an emeritus professor. He was awarded the Padma Bhushan after the Padma Shri in 2008. Professor Goswamy is best known for his scholarship on Pahari painting and Indian miniature paintings. He is the author of over 20 books on art and culture. His work, The Spirit of Indian Painting, Close Encounters with 101 Great Works, 1100 to 1900, is a treatise on selected creations from Jain manuscripts to Indian miniatures. The list of his published work is outstanding for the quality of research and writing. Collaborating with Eberhard Fischer, the Padma Shri winning Swiss-based German art historian and co-author of some of his books, he has staged a series of shows under the title Wonder of the Age in many parts of the world. Interestingly, he had started working in the IAS, but fortunately for the world of art and culture, he left after only 2 years to continue his studies in art. He has been associated mainly with the Punjab University, but has also been at University of Heidelberg for 8 years as a visiting professor, in addition to the universities such as Berkeley, Pennsylvania, and Zurich. The Museum of Fine Arts at Punjab University was set up by him, and he was the first director. In Mumbai, we know him as the man with the golden voice that mesmerized us, captivating the audience at the CSMBS Museum and the NCPA. And we look forward to hearing that voice again today. I know that you are all eagerly waiting to hear the two illustrious scholars. I shall now hand over to the chairman, Professor Dr. Goswami. Thank you, Ji. Thank you very much for acceding to our request. It's over to you.
Thank you very much, Winnell, for the kind words and for organizing this. It is a difficult task to be chairing a lecture by William. At the same time, it's the easiest of tasks because he's so widely known and so highly respected. You know, the great Urdu poet Mirza Ghalib, writing about himself at some point of time, said, पूछते हैं वो कि गालिब कौन है? पूछते हैं वो कि गालिब कौन है? कोई बतलाओ कि हम बतलाएं क्या? Everyone asks, who is Ghalib? And how can I answer that? Let somebody else do it for me. But he's not talking about his name alone. The word Ghalib means one who holds sway. It was a world of intense competition among poets at the court of Bahadur Shah Zafar. And the question was, who is the most wonderful, the most respected, the most innovative of poets? So it is the word Ghalib that he's using in that particular sense. Who holds sway? Tell me. And he obviously expects the answer to be Ghalib, of course. So there we are. You know, I was asked to introduce or chair a session where a person by the name of William Dalrymple was going to speak. A person, is he only a person? Is he an institution? Is he a force? Of course he is. And I must share with you very briefly an experience. I've met him several times. We are very good friends, wonderful friend. But at the Jaipur Literary Festival 2.5 years ago, where he was lecturing on this book of his, Anarchy, it was a moving experience. You know, in our temples, as we all know, that we bathe the main idol in 5 different objects, materials. And each time thing is poured, it could be milk now, then it's cleaned up. It could be ghee the next time, it's cleaned up. It could be honey the next time, and so on. So the experience that I had when I was listening to him on Anarchy was a little like that. Different layers, you know, the layer of investigation, the layer of information, the layer of analysis, the layer of anger that a company like this, a commercial company like this, should have done this to a country like India. And then, of course, the passion with which he speaks. On this particular theme, it is really quite extraordinary how much he has worked, how strongly he feels about this. And I remember his saying at the end of the lecture, it is not governments we must fear, it is corporations. Something like that. So there we are. I would warmly commend that you not only listen to him, but go to the book. But about the book, let me caution you, do not enter the area of bibliography. 40 closely printed pages, courses upon which he had drawn. But he's not going to read from those, I'm sure he is. So, like everyone else, I'm waiting to hear this force, this person, this institution called William Dalrymple. William, will you please speak to us?
BNG, what a treat to be introduced by you. My normal job at Jaipur is to be the kind of Robin for BNG's Batman. And one of the great pleasures of doing that is to gaze down onto the audience and see these transfixed people gazing up at BNG, looking very dapper, normally in a polo neck in January in the Jaipur chill, and seeing them sort of swoon into a trance when that golden voice begins to recite Ghalib or Mir or whichever poet he treats us to, and it's very more unusual for me to be the Batman in this and to give the lecture, and I'm very honoured that BNG has introduced me, and so grateful for him doing so. I'm going to share my screen, if I may, and go straight on to, here we go, the PowerPoint. Just going to share. There we go. This is the 4 books which I've been working on in the last 20 years. They've just come out as a box set. And the Anarchy, although it was the last to be written, is actually the first chronologically. Between them, they tell the story of this monstrous corporation from its founding, the first meetings in 1599 to it being rolled up in 1858. I particularly like to mention here my friend and collaborator, Bruce Winnell, who was a BNG-like figure, a great linguist and a man of enormous culture and civilization, with whom I worked for 20 years on all the Urdu and Persian sources. Bruce was one of those people who could pick up languages the way most of us pick up COVID. He had this extraordinary gift for, he spent many years in Persia and then migrated gradually eastwards. He lived in Peshawar for a long time, and then on and off for 20 years lived with us in Delhi, translating the many unread sources from this period. Because one of the things that attracted me to the study of the late Mughal period and the beginning of the company period was that it was one of those in-between moments in Indian history, not the great ages that the most distinguished minds have dedicated their lives to studying, but one of those periods that was oddly neglected. And I found it fascinating to find how much there was from the period of Shah Alam, Akbar Shah, and Bahadur Shah Zafar particularly, that had never been touched and really almost never worked on. And it's what every scholar really dreams of. And Bruce, for 20 years, in between going off to Afghanistan and working for the Aga Khan, translating gravestones and inscriptions all over Herat and Balkh and so on, would come to me every winter, and we would work through these sources, which these 4 books were based on. And very tragically, Bruce died just after the publication of the Anarchy, and before the books had come out as a set. And the whole thing is very much dedicated to him, and would have been completely impossible because Bruce had the ability to read not just printed Urdu and Persian sources, but was able to read the often very difficult scribal shorthands, which a lot of the materials are written in. And he would disappear off to some obscure library in Patna or in Tonk, or more central ones in Delhi or the British Library in London, and would emerge clutching photocopies of these manuscripts. And without him, really, it's impossible to imagine any of these books, but particularly the Anarchy, ever having come into being. And I miss him very much. So this story opens, perhaps surprisingly not in India, but I opened the book on the Welsh marches at Powys Castle, which, as you can see from this slide, is from the outside the very epitome of Englishness, with lovely Tudor box windows and box hedges, a wonderful sort of mock Renaissance front. But inside, in the long gallery, you're presented with a very different vision, because here is room after room of, and there's no other word for it, loot. Wonderful artworks, costumes, weaponry, even a Siraj-ud-Dowlah's palanquin abandoned on the fields of Plassey, or go through this palanquin, and the arch in the left-hand corner of this slide takes you to where Tipu Sultan's campaign tent has been re-erected in its new Welsh avatar. And I think you could make a case to say there's more first-class Mughal objects here in a private house in the Welsh borders than exists in any single museum in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, or Bangladesh, the 4 countries into which the Mughal Empire has fractured in modern times. What is it doing here? How come all these wonderful objects, golden finials from the tomb of Tipu Sultan, fabulous miniatures, wonderful textiles, what are they doing here? Well, the answer is told in a picture which you have to pass under to enter into this gallery containing all these treasures. And it shows, I mean, it's not a very good picture, this, I should say quickly. Benjamin West had never been to India. And by the time that he painted this picture from his imagination, most of the people in it were dead. The critics at the Royal Academy noted the dome in the background looked rather more like the dome of St. Paul's in London than anything in India. The scene is entirely imaginary, as the thing it conveys actually took place in private in a tent with poor old Shah Alam, the figure in the center, trussed up on a armchair that had been covered with a textile to make it look like a throne. But what this shows is a crucial turning point and a really very terrible moment in Indian history, because what you're seeing in this picture is Shah Alam passing to Robert Clive, for it is he, the slightly portly gentleman at the center, the right to run the economy of the three richest provinces of the Mughal Empire, Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. And with the passing of this act, the East India Company, which to that point had been, however aggressive and however militarized, nonetheless was primarily a trading company doing like any other business, buying things for one price and trying to sell it somewhere else for more and make money in the process for its shareholders. But with this single passing of this one piece of paper, the East India Company transforms into, bizarrely, a corporation which is also a colonial power. And not just a colonial power, it has just taken over the three richest provinces of the richest, what had very recently been the richest empire in the world. I think we're all seduced by, in a sense, the Bollywood version of the Mughals, where sort of pigeons flutter amid fountains and sort of slices of mangoes are dropped into concubines' mouths and all that thing, forgetting that, like any other empire in history, the Mughal Empire was built on economic power. And that economic power in the 18th century, mid-18th century, was located very much in the east of the country in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, but particularly Bengal, which had over 1 million looms. And which was frantically producing just under, these are very rough estimates because the real figures don't exist, of course, but roughly just under 40% of the world's gross domestic product. And when the time that the East India Company was founded, England, because Great Britain hadn't been created at that point, England controlled just under 7% of the world's economy. And was a far less rich and civilized part of the world, which is one of the reasons why its sailors had been forced to sail halfway around the world to the East Indies in the first case to try and increase their coffers. And England, which would become, thanks to India and thanks to the Caribbean slave trade, the richest country in the world by the mid-19th century, was in the 18th century way behind France and Italy, and certainly behind Spain and Portugal, which had been busy already looting the New World and transferring the gold and silver of the Incas and Aztecs to Europe. And this moment after the Battle of Buxar in 1765, when the Diwani is signed, transfers the wealth of Bengal not to a nation state, not to a government, not to the Foreign Office, not to the British Army, but instead to a corporation, to a business run not out of Buckingham Palace or Downing Street or some grand administrative block, but instead to this one tiny office, new East India House in Leadenhall Street, underneath what is now the Lloyd's building at the center of the City of London. And it's not even the two buildings on the right and left of this slide. It's just the 5 windows in the middle. A century into its existence, the East India Company had only 35 employees at this office in Leadenhall Street, an astonishing thought. And it didn't, at the time of Plassey, there were only 250 white English civil servants in Bengal. Yet this skeleton staff run out of this tiny building was responsible for the greatest corporate coup in history, which transferred the power of the richest country in the world to an office and a director's boardroom in the City of London. And the full strangeness, I think, of this transaction is what has driven me over the last 20 years to focus on the history of this company, because as BNG said in his introduction, it is an extraordinary moment in history that an empire is handed over to a commercial company that has no reason to exist and no pretense that it's doing anything more politically significant or philosophically for the benefit of mankind than merely giving its shareholders the maximum possible dividend every year and enriching its employees. And of course, it's, I mean, colonialism in any form, as I suppose I would argue we're seeing at the moment in Ukraine, is a horrific thing built on dead bodies and on the blood of those who are conquered. But a particularly sinister form of it must be to be colonized not by a state, but by a corporation that exists to make profit. So on earth did this strange quirk of history begin? Well, it all starts in 1599 in Moorgate Fields, when this man, this is Thomas Smythe, who's previously run the customs in London, calls a public meeting in this half-timbered Tudor hall around the time, almost to the week, that Shakespeare was completing the writing of Hamlet a mile away on the South Bank, just down from the Globe Theatre. And Smythe called a meeting, and we happened bizarrely again in the kind of one of the most remarkable things about the East India Company was it kept every single shred of paper it ever generated, it seems. In the British Library alone, there are apparently 35 miles of East India Company papers on the shelves in the massive basements of that library. And here we have this extraordinary document that records the very first meeting of the very first time that the East India Company gathers its potential subscribers on the 22nd of September, 1599. And you can see who's giving the money. At the top, there is the Mayor of London, number one. He's given £200. And the next chap's given 1,000, then 200, 300. And what's fascinating about this document is it goes on for several pages. And by the end, it's just shopkeepers giving, 5p and 10p and very small sums, vintners, leather workers, haberdashers, the ordinary shopkeepers of London. And what had happened with this meeting was that they were putting into place a new form of business administration that would, in a very important way, transform the world. All businesses up to this point had usually been family businesses, whether we're talking the Jugget sets in Bengal, or the Marco Polo Company in Venice, or the Medici cousins in Florence. And occasionally you had guild systems whereby, for example, all the wool merchants in Suffolk would club together and go off on trading expeditions to sell their wool or buy tapestries or whatever in Belgium or whatever it might be. The difference with a joint stock corporation, which was this extraordinary mechanism invented in Tudor England, was that anyone who had some spare cash but didn't necessarily want to get involved in the business could contribute money rather than their time to the business, and then receive a consummate share of their profits. And this very simple idea, for which you see the figures in front of you now, created a system whereby a successful business could raise vast sums of capital and launch an operation on the scale of the East India Company, which in time would become arguably the most powerful institution in the world. More powerful than many nation states, just as today its successors, the great corporations like Google, Facebook, Walmart, ExxonMobil, are richer than many nation states in Europe and the global South. So with this money that they gather, they go off to buy a ship, and they reject a creaky old hulk called the Mayflower that's sitting bobbing And of course, that will shortly go off in the opposite direction, westwards. And instead, the captain, who's been appointed by the shareholders, Sir James Lancaster, goes and buys a creaky pirate ship, which had been known as the Scourge of Malice, because Britain was a leading center of piracy in its day. They called it privateering, was the polite word at the Elizabethan court, but they basically got a license to go and raid Portuguese and Spanish shipping, and hopefully if they were lucky, meet a treasure ship coming back from Panama, bobbing with New World gold. And Lancaster had been doing this sort of thing. He'd also, the only man in England who tried to sail to the East Indies, he'd sunk on the way back, and many of his crew had been eaten by cannibals. He'd made it back by hitching a lift on another ship. So hardly a very glorious sailing career, but he at least knew the way, which was more than anyone else in Britain did. And so they buy the Scourge of Malice, and they, like all good corporations, they spin it. They turn its name to the Red Dragon, which sounds more cozy, like a nice pub in the Welsh borders. And off they sail, and they briefly get stuck off the coast of Dover. The winds fail, and for a week they're bobbing around, and people come and wave at them, and everyone is of the opinion that this voyage is not going to get anywhere at all, that it's going to be a terrible failure. But the wind picks up, and off they sail, and in due course they cross the Cape, and in due course they come across one of their, exactly what they've been looking for. They come across a Portuguese treasure ship coming back from the East Indies, full of cloves, pepper, and nutmeg, particularly nutmeg. Because it had dropped at the island of Run, where all nutmeg came from. And they attack the ship. The crew is full of ex-pirates, so they know exactly how to do this sort of thing. And they simply transfer the contents from one hold to their hold, and then sail back again and sell the proceeds in London for £1 million. And that is the way that the East India Company has found an extraordinary moment of sort of global piracy, gets an entire empire going. And in due course, they build a new headquarters on Leadenhall Street, the site that they will continue to occupy for the rest of their time. Initially, it looks a bit like, again, like a bit of a pub, a nice old sort of Elizabethan building with glass windows, a nice balcony, and pictures of sailing ships up at the top. But where they really invest their money is in ships, and they buy a dockyard at Deptford and begin making state-of-the-art ships. And initially, they are not aimed at India at all. They're aimed at the East Indies, which means in our terms, Indonesia, where the spices come from. And they are competing with the Dutch, and they fail to compete with the Dutch. And by the 1640s, 40 years into their career, like a modern startup which has gone awry, they have to refinance. They're defeated in battle by the Dutch, and the Amboina massacre takes place. And they come to a treaty with the Dutch eventually, whereby they hand over Run and the East Indies to them, and in return are given as a kind of sop to save their face, a muddy island in the Hudson River, the other side of the world, called Manhattan. And that, of course, turns out in the long run to be a rather good investment. Though at the time, it's not seen as such. And at this point in 1640, they decide to reevaluate their business. And they basically move from trading spices with the East Indies to a decision to trade textiles with India, and specifically with a new foundation of theirs, Calcutta, which has proven surprisingly profitable, despite the fact that most of its factors seem to keep dying. They die like rotten sheep, is the diary entry for one of the first years in Calcutta. But this is, of course, a very good moment to invest in Bengal. 1640, Shah Jahan is on the throne in Agra, and the extraordinary ability of Bengal to create textiles that are competitive around the world, of higher quality and made more cheaply, but also sort of fancy textiles of silks and embroideries, as well as the simple cotton. And within a few years, the English managed to effectively become the Mughal Navy, bizarrely. They managed to outperform the Dutch and the Portuguese and the French in this, and they reap the profits of the weavers of Bengal, so much so that they end up, for example, you get deindustrialization in Mexico, as far away as Mexico, because of the number of cheap Indian cotton exports which are going into Mexico. But none of this, of course, or very little of this, is going back to the weavers in Bengal. The profits are instead being sent to London. The company becomes richer and richer. As we know, the wedding gift of Catherine of Braganza gives them the island of Bombay, B-U-M-B-Y, on the marriage treaty. And no one in the English court knows where Bombay is. The Lord Chancellor says it must be somewhere near Brazil, because the map which has been attached to the marriage treaty has got lost between Portugal and London. Anyway, it turns out that Bombay is indeed an island off the coast of India, and that is turns into a very profitable base too, as does the new foundation at Madras Putnam. And these three bases become increasingly profitable, and all goes very well until the death of Aurangzeb and the rapid collapse of the Mughal Empire after 1707 changes the equation. Then, as you all know, the Marathas emerge out of the Maharashtrian highlands, led by Shivaji, burning Surat, taking over most of central India. At the same time, a little bit later, the Sikhs rise up in the Punjab, the Jats are restive in the Doab, and Delhi, the largest city in the world between Istanbul and Tokyo, and the richest city, sits like a ripe mango waiting for someone to pluck it. And no one knows, is it going to be the Marathas? Is it going to be the Sikhs? Will it be the Jats? In the end, of course, it's none of them. And this fabulous city with, this, of course, a slightly later picture by Mazhar Ali Khan done in the 1820s, but it gives you a good impression of what a spectacular sight Delhi must have been in its heyday. And of course, it's none of those who ultimately pluck this mango. It is this rather somber and humorless character, Nadir Shah, who unexpectedly sweeps down from Persia, having got rid of the Safavids and staged what I suppose today we'd call a military coup. Comes through Kabul, down the Khyber Pass, meets no significant opposition, takes Lahore. And at this point, he's not planning to conquer India. He's just wanting to, as he puts it to his physician, pluck some golden feathers from the Mughal peacock's tail. In other words, get some money with which to finance his real ambitions, which are to take on the Ottomans and the Russians. And he sees the Mughals merely as a cash cow, which indeed they turn out to be, because on the Battle of Karnal, his extraordinarily successful small cavalry force, armed with swivel guns, which are these enormous jezails that turn a cavalry man into a sort of light tank in 18th century terms, with armor penetrating slugs, is used to very vicious effect on the field of Karnal, where a massive Mughal army is defeated, and silly old Muhammad Shah Rangila goes to dinner with Nadir Shah, where he's then arrested and marched into Delhi on Nadir Shah's, or I think on his own elephant, with Nadir Shah at the back of the howdah. And 6 weeks later, as you all know, he leaves with 8,000 wagons of jewels and money. The Peacock Throne, which contains the Koh-i-Noor and the Darya-Noor, the slightly larger diamond, which everyone forgets about, which is still sitting in Tehran, where Nadir Shah left it. And this changes the equation completely. Where before the company had faced this incredibly rich empire with 1 million men under arms, suddenly the India fractures. It's as if you take a great Baroque mirror and throw it out a second floor window, and the shards of glass scatter in every direction. And instead of one big empire, you have Jodhpur, Jaipur, Hyderabad, Nagpur, all these individual city-states and competing Mughal powers, such as the Nizam of Hyderabad, the various Maratha leaders, all competing with each other. And the two forces who really hoover up are none of these, but instead the two East India companies, the French, the Compagnie des Indes, based out of Pondicherry, and the East India Company here, the Madras Sepoys. And what happens at the same time that India fractures and divides itself into hundreds of very easily digestible city-states, which are militarily weak. This is, of course, also, as the work of BNG has showed us, a time of spectacular cultural achievement. At the same time as India politically is going to pieces, we see all the delightful paintings of Ninesuk and Manaku and all BNG's Pahari masters being produced up in the hills. But down in Madras, sinister things are going on because the East India Company and its French rivals have both imported new European military techniques developed on the fields of Europe during the War of the Austrian Succession by Frederick the Great. And Frederick the Great has realized that if you arm infantrymen and drill them and combine it with 18th century discoveries in ballistics and mobile field artillery and a whole load of other sort of military advances that 18th century science has brought to bear on military thinking, that you can create a new type of warfare that can defeat any cavalry army, the old style of warfare. And this turns out to be the case and is very rapidly put to the test. First of all, in 1740, at the Battle of the Adyar River, just outside Madras, when a very small French force of trained sepoys defeat an enormous cavalry army of the Nawabs of the Carnatic. Then again, in the early Carnatic Wars. And finally, this new military technique is put to action most effectively and most famously when Siraj Ad-Dowlah, seen here in a gorgeous picture from the Swinton album, which Jerry Losty wrote wonderfully about before he died. Siraj Ad-Dowlah takes Calcutta at perfect bad timing because within a month of him taking Calcutta, Clive has turned up from London on a wild goose chase. He's actually come to look for a French fleet. There's a piece of intelligence sitting in the National Archives in Delhi that shows why he came. There'd been reports that the French had sent an enormous fleet, which the company thought was going to attack Bengal, so they sent Clive after him. In fact, they'd got it wrong. The French fleet was there, but it had sailed for the Americas, where it was involved in all the early activities of the 7-Year War, all that sort of last of the Mohican stuff. Anyone seen that wonderful movie with Daniel Day-Lewis with all those sort of American Indian war parties crossing Lake Huron and so on? That was where they were going, and Clive had gone off in the wrong direction. But he's in the perfect position to retake Calcutta when the news comes to Madras that it's fallen. And so he goes north and he retakes Calcutta, and then he gets a message from the Jagat Sets, the great bankers of Murshidabad, who want him to join their conspiracy to get rid of Siraj Ad-Dowlah. And again, it's not something that you read much in nationalist textbooks, but it is nonetheless an extraordinary fact that is in every serious account of what happens in 1757, that Clive fights the Battle of Plassey, not primarily as an employee of the East India Company, who have not authorized him to fight this battle, but instead as the employee of the Jagat Sets, who have paid him a very, very large sum to topple Siraj Ad-Dowlah for them. And Plassey is a setup. Mir Jafar, Siraj Ad-Dowlah's main general, who's a not very bright Arab from what's now Iraq, who has set himself up as the main general for Siraj Ad-Dowlah, defects halfway through the battle, and Clive famously walks into the Murshidabad treasury at the end of the battle and helps himself to everything, stuffs his pockets, and then puts the remaining treasures from Murshidabad on 100 punts, which they then just sail down the river to Calcutta. Later, when he's hauled before Parliament and asked what the hell he was up to and why he thought he could just go off and take money from a group of Indian bankers to wage war on a man who'd already been forced to give up Calcutta, and why he thought he could help himself to this enormous sum of money, Clive famously tells Parliament, "My lords, I was astonished at my own moderation." But however this happened, the company is now the main power broker in Bengal. And a few years later, 1765, at the Battle of Buxar, the company goes on to defeat not just Shah Alam here, but the new Nawab of Bengal, but also Shuja'ud-Dawla of Awadh, and so finds itself by 1765 in charge of the whole of what we would call Cowbelt, the whole of UP and the Gangetic Plain. And so bizarrely, by 1765, a private corporation, still run out of an office in London, still operating only for the benefit of shareholders, has found itself the main military power in North India. It hasn't yet defeated the Marathas or Tipu Sultan, all of whom remain targets for the future. And the company begins to use the revenues of Bengal to increase the size of its army. And we go from 10,000 sepoys to 20,000 to, by 1799, 200,000 sepoys at a time when the British army is only 100,000 men. In other words, this private corporation by 1799 had an army twice the size of the British army. The astonishing fact that, again, sort of sits very oddly with our ideas of nationality and so on, and patriotism, is that the company conquered India with Indian soldiers and capital raised from Indian bankers. Bankers such as the Jagat Seths and the other Marwari bankers of Bengal compete to supply the company with the funds to raise this mercenary army, with only a skeleton staff still of white officers. Why? Simply because the company and the bankers speak the same language. They both speak the language of international finance. They both understand the importance of interest rates and commercial contracts. It's two sets of financiers understanding each other. The horrific but true story of the late 18th century in India is the story of a corporation using Indian finance and Indian manpower using Indian money and Indian soldiers to conquer India. It's a very, very odd story. If you think of the way that India had developed in the centuries preceding this, with all the social systems, all the military knowledge, whole succession of peoples coming down from Afghanistan and so on. And then overnight, the whole picture is changed completely by a multinational corporation, a bunch of shareholders collaborating with Indian bankers and training up Indian troops, offering them better wages than anyone else. And the company loots, pillages, asset strips, ships the money back to London. But the one thing it never neglects to do is to repay its financiers. It repays on time with interest according to commercial contracts, which it honors. And that is why the bankers continue to back them rather than backing the Marathas or Tipu. So by the 1780s, you have a situation where here we have Captain Todd sort of running off doing his land assessments in Rajasthan, but across the whole of India, you've got East India Company officials assessing land, raising land tax. No longer does the East India Company have to send money out to India to buy the wondrous textiles and the spices and the saltpeter and all the other things it's trading with. It merely uses the land tax that it charges the conquered people of the North Indian plains. It then grows opium in Bihar and turns itself into the largest narco operator in history, making the Medellin cartel look like child's play compared to the scale of the opium trade that the company is involved in. They grow opium in Bihar, they sell it in Hong Kong illegally, they fight 2 opium wars to back up their right to sell opium as they see it to the beleaguered Chinese. With the money for that, they buy tea, which they sell in India, in Europe, and in America. And it is, of course, East India Company tea, which is poured into Boston Harbor at the beginning of the American Revolution. And it is indeed the East India Company flag, which then provides the model for the American flag after the Revolution, by which stage the East India Company has grown into this vast corporation. That tiny little building like a country pub that we saw at the beginning is now transformed into something that looks more like Buckingham Palace. The director's boardroom is this fantastically grand room from which India is controlled, not Racecourse Road, but here in Leadenhall Street. Vast docks, East India Company docks, where all the goodies and the loot from India is unloaded. And even more remarkably, the main Brunswick dock, where all the tea clippers and opium clippers are made. These stated that this is the equivalent. Think of all the planes lined up in Mumbai airport or in Delhi today. This is the equivalent of the 18th century. These clippers lined up one after another to move the goods of India to market and to take the loot back. The important and crucial event that it takes place in the middle of this is that so greedy has the company become that they actually generate a spectacular famine in 1770. The famine is, of course, natural. The rains have failed for 2 years, but unlike any responsible ruler who has built granaries and then sets up soup kitchens and employment. For example, the Imam Bara in Lucknow is built as famine work by the Nawabs of Awadh, but the company does not see itself as at all responsible for the starving millions of Bengal in 1770, and maybe 3 million die between 1770 and 1772. In year one, the company simply sends the sepoys out into the villages and hangs anyone who doesn't pay their taxes, even if they're starving. And that works for 1 year. And when the company investors hear that full tax has been gathered in 1770 despite the famine, they vote to increase their dividend from 10% to 12.5%, even though they know that 1 million Bengalis at least have died that year. But in the years that followed, this is of course unsustainable, and the company has effectively throttled the goose that laid its golden egg. And by 1772, the company's bust. A whole succession of bank failures across Europe follow. And unlike Lehman Brothers during the subprime collapse a decade ago, the East India Company by this stage is, of course, too big to fail, because it controls half of British exports and imports, and is the largest single employer in Great Britain. So the company is bailed out, not by the Bank of England, which doesn't have enough money to bail out the company losses, which are so massive because of their own greed, but it is bailed out by Parliament. And in 1774, the Regulating Act, it sounds a very boring parliamentary bill, but what it means is that the state, for the first time, becomes the majority shareholder of the company. And there, for the first time, what has up to this point been a libertarian dream of completely unregulated trade, backed by military force, becomes for the first time what I suppose today we would call a public-private partnership. And the state, once it's got its hands into the company, never lets it go. And you see increasing state control of the East India Company throughout the late 18th century and the early 20th century, until its sort of trading functions effectively wither and fall away, and it loses its monopoly on trade. And in the end, it is its own sepoys, the Indian troops that had conquered not only all of India, but had shed their blood as far as northern Afghanistan for the company. And even in the early 1800s, had been shipped to Java and to Egypt to fight colonial wars there. These sepoys finally have enough in 1857, when they are led to believe that the company is about to try and convert them by force to Christianity, the whole business of those grease cartridges. And in the catastrophe of the Great Uprising of 1857 and the mass hangings which follow, with hundreds of thousands killed across North Indian plains, in Lucknow, Kanpur, and in Delhi. In Delhi, every single unarmed male, every single male over the age of 16 is considered to be a combatant and is murdered. In the terrible mess that follows this, the company is finally wound up, and this is the reaction of Punch, taking a riff on the idea of the East India Company blowing sepoys from the mouth of the cannon. Here you have East India House, the headquarters in Leadenhall Street of the company, blown from a cannon. And as the documents and the wood of the company goes splitting in all directions, we see nepotism, blundering, avarice, and misgovernment as the way. So the company, is not regarded with any fondness, even in Britain, which it has done so much to enrich. It is recognized even then that the company is an extremely dodgy institution. And one of the things that surprised me most during my research was looking at British newspapers from this period and finding how unpopular the company was. People disliked, just as they disliked the merchant bankers and hedge fund managers who in the 1980s, would crash their porches into restaurants and let off fire extinguishers and behave badly. So the company officials coming back from India with vast wealth not only behaved very badly and were considered uncivilized and nouveau riche characters, but they also, it was well known, was corrupting Parliament. How? Because it's recognized for the first time by the company that a corporation can use its military strength its economic strength, not only to use its military power on supine Indians and Javanese and whoever else people of Hong Kong, whoever else they want to attack and conquer, but they could also corrupt the country of origin. And within a century, in 1690, the company for the first time is caught bribing British MPs with wads of cash. And this is the first time in world history that one gets something that is, of course, very familiar in any democracy today, that the idea of a corporation bribing Parliament, bribing a legislature. And this, of course, is something which will continue to this day, whether it's newspaper articles about what the Adanis or the Tatars or everyone else may be up to in India, but the similar things going on in Britain with HSBC, or in America with all the different lobbying groups. This all begins with the East India Company, this first multinational which developed not only the techniques to asset strip entire countries, but also developed the lobbying mechanisms to corrupt the legislature through its own wealth at home. And when you have a company which has the power to outbid anyone else and can, whether openly through bribes or covertly through jobs and salaries, provide enormous sums of wealth to legislators, you have the whole of modern history beginning to unfold. And of course, we've seen in the 20th century many cases where giant corporations and multinationals can bring down governments, whether we're talking Mossadegh in 1950s in Iran, who democratically elected chooses to nationalize the Anglo-Persian oil company, only for the CIA and MI6 to stage a coup and bring the Shah to power. Whether it's a few years later, United Fruit doing a similar coup in Guatemala after another socialist government threatens to nationalize United Fruit's farms, and that creates the phrase banana republic, because United Fruit has been growing bananas in Guatemala. Or whether in the 1970s in Chile, ITT persuades the CIA to intervene to bring down Allende and bring the terrible junta to power in Chile. So companies face two ways. They don't just face their shareholders and they don't just face the people they're trading with, but they can also corrupt internally the countries they come from. And this, of course, is why this is so important today. This is not just a story of how colonialism operates and how money drives colonialism and how capitalism and colonialism have walked in a strange lockstep together, but it was also the story of how huge corporations can become more powerful than national governments. And in the age of Facebook and Google and ExxonMobil and these giant corporations, we should be lucky that Elon Musk is building space rockets rather than ICBMs. Luckily, no modern corporation today, although some of the oil companies have large security forces, no corporation today has a standing army of 200,000 infantrymen like the East India Company had. I'll just end with a quote from the impeachment of Warren Hastings. Hastings, I think, is as undervalued as Clive is overvalued, but nonetheless, at his impeachment, the only time that the company is actually put on trial in Britain, this is what the Lord Chancellor says at the opening of the trial. This is Edward, 1st Baron Thurlow, opening the impeachment of Warren Hastings. Corporations, he says, have neither bodies to be punished nor souls to be condemned. They therefore do as they like. Thank you very much. BNG, over to you.
You know, may I?
Hanji,
Yes.
it's over to you now, Dr. Goswami.
May I once again say how thrilling it is. I mean, this mastery of facts and this analysis and the passion. You know, when I opened this book, in the first paragraph of the first chapter, William talks about, it starts with a very simple statement. On the 25th of September, 1599, when Shakespeare was probably bringing to close his writing of Hamlet, a company was being founded. A poet will think of doing a thing like this. Start off with a great literary figure and bring us down to reality of a corporation which ruled over us for 250 years. That's what he reminded us of. The British government came into being, the British, that is the empire, 1857, and they left in 1947, 90 years in all. And the East India Company ruled over us, more or less, for 250 years. Something to worry about, something to think about. You know, when I look at the logo of the East India Company, and maybe not many people are familiar with that, this is what it is. East India Company, EIC. And there is a kind of a triangular kind of a thing. And if you break up those three arms, each of one becomes a crucifix. This is how we were crucified, by this extraordinary corporation. If you remember the sentences which William was using, they conquered India with the help of Indian soldiers. There's something worrying about it, something deeply worrying about it. It's a dark age, the 18th century, for us. Dark. Extraordinary stupidity on our part, extraordinary cleverness and discipline on the part of the East India Company, exploiting every little chink of weakness that we had in our character, in our politics. And there we are. What was Shah Alam like? I mean, Shah Alam, can you imagine this? The name Shah Alam means the Lord of the universe. And it is said there was a doggerel going around at that time, Padshah-e Shah Alam as Dilli ta Palam. The extent of rule, extent of empire that he has extends from Delhi to Palam. Just that. With a name like that. You know, but we are insensitive to all this, unfortunately. You know, in the city of Delhi, there's an area called Andha Mughal, the blind Mughal. People live in that, carry on their lives, use the word Andha Mughal, Absolutely. I mean, as if it is the most normal thing in the world to be blind and to be blinded and continue to be an emperor, something like that. So, what are we talking about? Essentially, something deeply, deeply worrying. When I was a young boy studying at school, my father took us to a place in the hills, a hill station called Dalhousie in the Punjab. And there, this was pre-independence India, one went to a little poetic symposium. And one of the persons, there was quiet but kind of hesitant words of protest against what the British were doing to us at that time. I remember even at that age, I must have been 8 or 9 years old. I remember very clearly one poet in a Punjabi saying, "E gori gaan asile, na jane singh hilan, khave pive hind vich dudh deve Inglistan." This white-skinned cow that we have is seemingly very quiet, peaceful, doesn't even move its horns. The trouble is, it eats in India and yields milk in England. A poet like Josh Malihabadi, who was an angry man. And Josh Malihabadi, I mean, for all, it was an impotent rage at that particular time. But I remember having read, I only remember a few lines by heart, but I have the poem here with me. And if I may, through the courtesy of Winnell and Ushaji, read a little bit of that poem. Not that I suspect that William by this time knows a number of Indian languages too, but if he's not, even if he does, it is a poem addressed to East India Company ke farzandon se khitab, and addressed to the children, the inheritors of the East India Company. This is pre-independent India. किस जुबान से कह रहे हो आज तुम सौदागर हो, दैर में इंसानियत के नाम को ऊंचा करो. What right do you have to talk about humanity? This is when the world war is going on. What right? What are you talking about? What humanity are you pleading for us, before us? दैर में इंसानियत के नाम को ऊंचा करो. And so on. Let's go to जब यहाँ आए थे तुम सौदागरी के वास्ते, नौ इंसान के मुस्तकबिल से क्या वाकिफ न थे? When you came here as street traders, simple traders, did you not know anything about the kind of humanity that you are preaching to us at this particular time? हिंदियों के जिस्म में क्या रूह आजादी न थी? सच बताओ, क्या वो इंसानों की आबादी न थी? एंगर लूटते फिरते थे तुम जब कारवां दर कारवां, सर बिरहना फिर रही थी दौलते हिंदुस्तान. Caravan after caravan, you were plundering. And it is as if the chaste bride of India with the veil removed from its head was walking around. दस्तकारों के अंगूठे काटते फिरते थे तुम, सर्द लाशों से गढ़ों को पाटते फिरते थे तुम. Like that. Anger, impotent rage. The point, however, that is made by all this extraordinary research that William has conducted, not only the research, but it is the putting together. All these characters that we used to study in our school days, Mir Qasim, Mir Jafar, the Muhammad Shah Rangila, the Marathas, the Jats, the Sikhs, and so on and so forth. They were just like shadow puppets. I mean, one didn't realize at that particular time what extraordinary game was being played. What an extraordinary, scheme that this particular company had up their sleeves, and how soft we were, how stupid we were. I'm not here to fulminate against any, it is impotent rage, you could say. But what comes out of this, reading this, once again being reminded of this in this organized, disciplined manner that William has done, and that you must learn. There's time to learn that there are dangers lurking around every corner, that we can be made into the same position. I remember a photograph, an old photograph, where two English soldiers, one of them is an official, the other one's a soldier, and an Indian wearing a briefest of loincloths, lying absolutely prostrate at the feet of these and literally licking the shoes of the officer. Are we going to be in that state again? I don't know. I do not know. I have no knowledge, no prescience, no prediction that is I can make and so on. But merely looking at that dark, dungeon-like century, the 18th century, in which all these characters were playing their parts, should make us sit back and then rise and take care, caution, prepare ourselves, because the times are not gone. What right do I have to say all this? What research have I done? Nothing. But I do feel very, very deeply when I read all this, and it comes back to me with a bang. This is what a corporation can do. This is what it did. This is what it might. It doesn't have to be in the form of an East India company. It can be any corporation, can be any power concentrated in the hand of a person who know how to use that power ruthlessly. That is what it is all about. Once again, I have learned. Once again, I am moved, and I'm very grateful to you, William, and equally grateful to Winnell, Sagar, and to Usha ji, and to the Asiatic Society for giving me the opportunity to be present, not to preside over lecture. What can I do? What role can I play in that? But just be able to be present and be reminded of dark times, which are not gone. Thank you very much indeed. I'm most grateful that I got this opportunity, Winnell ji and Usha ji and the Asiatic Society. And of course, to my very dear friend, William Dalrymple, whom I do not see, as I said in the beginning, as a person, but a force, an institution. Thank you.
Thank you, BNG.
Thank you, G. Thank you very much indeed. I think perhaps Usha, you would like to select the questions in the chat box.
Yeah, there are quite a few questions. Shall I read them out?
One by one, yes?
Yes.
And then perhaps later on we can ask people to unmute themselves and speak.
Sure. Yeah.
But let us take the questions first. Yeah.
So the first one is by Professor Arvind Ganachari. He says, it's an interesting observation. One finds the name of James Dalrymple in Bombay administration as writer in the early 1820s. He also hailed from Scotland. And he remained in the English East India Company administration till 1840 in Bombay. Do you belong to the same family?
I do. I'm ashamed to say that this one of the reasons that I've became so interested in the East India Company is that I'm complicit genetically with so much of its activity. My family came from exactly the social class that the East India Company was recruited from, particularly Scots. One of the reasons the Scots joined with the English, who they hated, was the chance to get their hands on some of the loot that was flowing by 1707 from the company. And it was never the lords and the earls and the dukes and so on who joined the company, because 2/3 of the young men who went out to India didn't come back. It was a very high risk proposition to join the company. But if you were desperate, if your purse and income as a family never quite matched your social aspirations, in other words, if you were from the kind of lower squirearchy and the vicar's sons and so on, those were the people that joined the company, those that desperately needed to make money in order to support their social aspirations. And generations of my family joined the company from the early 1700s. One of my direct ancestors was actually called the Gateway to India because he exercised patronage to such an extent as an MP for people joining the company. And a stair Dalrymple was in the Black Hole in 1756. And as recently as my great-grandfather was born in Calcutta at the end of the last century. And I have, as was so common in the 18th century, and the subject of my book, White Moguls, which is the second book of the quartet, I have Bengali blood from Chandanagar in my veins from that time. And I'm 1/32 Bengali, not quite matching BNG, but it's there. Yeah, every generation for 10 generations came out here, all the younger sons. I am the younger son of my generation and seem to have defied 1947 by continuing, but not, I'm glad to say, as an employee of the company or the Raj on my own freewheeling game here.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Alekri has asked two questions. One is, will the language of finance make a difference in the modern world? Example, in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You mentioned India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. There are similarities and contrasts of India's intervention in East Pakistan to lead it to the nation of Bangladesh, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think he wants you to compare between India's invasion of Bangladesh or East Pakistan and Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
I mean, I think, honestly, all military interventions have some things in common. I wouldn't particularly compare the intervention in Bangladesh to the East India Company, but there's no doubt that economics drive countries today as much as economic history dictated the past. And one of the great advantages of studying the East India Company period of history is it does make very clear how much the business of finance, the business of empire, is the thing which generates so much of this history. Those of us like BNG and I who are more interested in the art and the culture of the period than the finance, it always my natural inclination is not to study the economics, but writing this company quartet, obviously I've had to do that, and you do realize how much this whole story is the story of money. And making money and how to make the most money, and how far this controls and drives this history. I mean, I wouldn't have thought this is so much the case either in the Indian intervention in Pakistan, or even in the the Russian invasion of Ukraine, both of which I think are slightly different stories, but many other imperial adventures have been driven by money. And in that sense, the company's takeover of India and Nadir Shah's invasion in 1739 are very much of a piece.
Professor Ganachari, again, can you throw some light on the tense relations between the English East India Company and the British Crown? Judges like William Jones, James Mackintosh, and Elias Impey were appointed by the British Crown, and they were not responsible to the company.
So that's one of the major themes of the book, because it does start off very much as this libertarian company which is unregulated and can therefore do as it likes, even though it has a charter, a royal charter setting it up. But from the 1770s on, from 1774, the Regulating Act, the Crown gets its hands on the company. And Elijah Impey, rather than Elias Impey, Elijah Impey is the first judge sent out under the Regulating Act. At the same time, Warren Hastings is the first Governor General appointed by the Crown. And it's a transitional moment because, of course, Hastings had grown up in the company and was a company man, but thereafter, you have more and more officials being sent out from London. So, for example, the extraordinary story of Wellesley, Richard Wellesley, the elder brother of the Duke of Wellington, is that he's the first one who really realizes that the Crown can use the company for its own benefit. This is now the period of Napoleon. Napoleon has fought Austerlitz, has taken over the whole of Europe to the fear of the British, and Richard Wellesley is sent out to India to use the East India Company armies for the benefit of the Crown. And it's like a cuckoo in the company nest. He is a government man appointed by the Crown who uses this commercial company's private security force, the sepoys, to fight a series of battles against what he sees as the potential allies of the French. First of all, the French contingent in Hyderabad under Raymond in 1789, then the 1798. Then in 1799, he turns his attention to Tipu, who has a whole French regiment and who calls himself Citizen Tipu and has a Republican, bizarrely has a whole series of Republican ceremonies which he enacts. And then finally, the Marathas, who they fight not because they're the Marathas, but because they have French generals like de Boyne and Perron controlling their armies. So what's interesting about that period, the final bit with under Wellesley, is that you have, in a sense, the state briefly defeating the corporation. And this is what's so fascinating about the story of the company, is it is this battle underneath all the wars that one reads about in history books. There is this other hidden tussle between the power of the state and the power of the corporation. Initially, the corporation wins out. The corporation manages to bribe Parliament. Not only do they have, as all companies do in the present day, the ability to provide perks and salaries to MPs and legislators. But they also, there's so many company men buying rotten boroughs and entering Parliament by the 1790s that they have their own interest, like their own party within Parliament, and the company votes, and the company men vote as a bloc for company interests when it comes up. On top of which, there's then a third level of interference, which is the fact that 2/3 of parliamentarians in the 1780s have company shares, and therefore want to have a commercial interest in the success of the company. So you have three different levels at which the company is helping run the state, and is hugely influential. But then in the 1790s, under Wellesley, the state makes a comeback. So there's this, beneath, in a sense, the surface story the company fighting various Indian powers, you have another story hidden behind that, behind the curtains, of this tussle between the state and the corporation. And ultimately, of course, in this story, it is the state which wins, and ultimately the corporation is, in our terms, effectively nationalized in 1858. Whether the same will be true of the great corporations of our day, who you know, I don't know whether you remember last year, there was this great thing when all the different powers of the G20 formed together to try and find ways of taxing Amazon and these multinationals who somehow managed to avoid taxes in all countries by having their profits declared in places like the Bahamas and Panama and all these tax havens. And one of the largest employers in the world was managing to avoid being taxed in any country. And so this is again the question of how a state can tame a powerful corporation, and that's the hidden story behind the front story, so to speak.
This question is by Ms. Rashmi Podar. She's asking, what were the Jagat Seths trying to achieve through overthrowing Siraj-ud-Dawla?
Hi, Rashmi. I didn't know you were there. I can't see you on the screen, but very nice to hear you're watching. So the Jagat Seths. Hi, Rashmi. Hello. The Jagat Seths were the great kingmakers of Bengal. They had put into power Aliverdi Khan, who was the grandfather, was the great uncle of Siraj-ud-Dawla, and they were used to making and unmaking governors of the Mughal Empire to their taste. And Siraj-ud-Dawla, contrary to nationalist textbook, it was very clear why the Jagat Seths wished to get rid of him. Firstly, he was a psychopath. Who was, it's one of the few things that all the sources of the period agree on. The English sources, the French sources, the Dutch sources, the Bengali sources, and the Mughal sources of the time all agree that Siraj was this kind of, this sort of violent, rather like Uday Hussein in sort of the guy who used to shoot members of the football team in Iraq if they didn't win enough goals in their matches. Siraj was a deeply unpleasant character, but more to the point, he damaged business. The Jagat Seths made their money lending money to the East India Company and the other international corporations, and by attacking Calcutta and trying to drive the company out of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla was threatening the Jagat Seths' main source of income. So they joined together with this conspiracy. They pay Mir Jafar, they pay Clive, and again, this was something which, you know, the British textbooks that I grew up on always make out Plassey to be this great British victory. The Indian textbooks make out Plassey to be this sort of terrible British scam, but no one really emphasizes what clearly is the truth when you read the detail, is that Plassey is entirely a fixed operation set up by the Jagat Seths, for which they offer large sums of money to all participants. And there's a very, very good early 20th century study of the Jagat Seths, but surprisingly, no recent book which really tells their story. And they're some of the most powerful and fascinating figures, and what they do is some of the most revealing parts of 18th century history. If you follow the Jagat Seths, if you follow the money, you see everything else becomes clear. Follow the cash, as they say, investigative journalists, great cry, and it works very much in history too.
The next question is by Captain Yonad Banerjee. He is asking, hypothetically, if Nadir Shah had not invaded, what, according to you, would have been the likely political situation to have emerged at that time, considering the decline of the Mughals?
Well, clearly the Marathas were the most powerful, but the Marathas were never united after Shivaji's time. And by the time of Nadir Shah, as one historian put it, the Marathas are more like a bag of ferrets than a confederacy. They are continually fighting each other. And where Richard Wellesley is so clever is the way that he manages to set Scindia and Holkar, who are the two most powerful Maratha leaders of his day, against each other. And he manages to do that trick of his spies get a letter from I think it's Scindia is writing to Nagpur saying, after this is over, we must get rid of Holkar. And they managed to get this letter delivered as if by accident to Holkar. And Holkar, who's about to fight, join with Scindia to fight together against Arthur Wellesley, which would have been a battle which may well have been won. Instead, Holkar turns around and goes away, leaving the Battle of is it Argaum, one of those 1803 battles, to fight alone. And of course, it's the victory that Wellesley says he never wishes to win again, because he loses half his army in the course of the battle. But had the Marathas stood together, even at that stage in 1803, they would have defeated the company, but they didn't. So whether the Marathas would have been united enough after, I mean, the great figure I'm always fascinated by is Nana Fadnavis, who is by far the wisest and most clever of the Maratha leaders. And he realizes the existential threat that the company poses India. And he tries to get not only the different Maratha leaders to unite against them, but also to get an alliance with Tipu and the Nizam of Hyderabad, and for all three to attack the company together, the Triple Alliance. But it never succeeds. He fails in that. And not only does he not manage to get the Triple Alliance to last more than a year, Scindia makes his own peace with Warren Hastings on his own, without consulting Poona. And so Nana Fadnavis, despite his misgivings, fails to unite everybody against the company, and the result is the company wins.
Can you please throw some light on the abuse and corruption in sending writers and cadets aged 15 and 17?
So the idea was that you couldn't join the company after your 16th birthday. So this is what's so extraordinary. All these characters like Warren Hastings and all the ones subsequently who rise in the company, none of them have memories of England after their 16th birthday. They come out here so young. And the idea is that the company can mold them, can teach them, a whole variety of skills that they need, from languages through to accounting and so on. But it does sort of, psychologically, it's very interesting. These are 16-year-olds, they wouldn't be able to buy a drink today when they first come out into the writers' building in Calcutta to be trained up, to be put in these, what they call chummeries. And they're kids, they're 16-year-olds, they're children taking their O-levels. When they arrive, and most of them either die or most of them die within the first couple of years, the famous 2 monsoons, but those that survive and get the antibodies then have the chance of making the fortunes they've come out to make, and most of them retire by the time they're 40. So you have this whole world of ex-East India Company men with fortunes who've taken over Parliament by the 1790s, with all the loot that they've milked out of India, and some of them retire, in the 18th century with £1 million at the age of 40, and you could add 2 noughts to that. So that this is like the oligarchs. This is like all these people we've seen sailing their massive yachts around, trying to find safe havens in Turkey and places in the last couple of weeks. The company men have these vast sums of money. No one in Britain can compete with the money that a successful company employee brings back. And the reason that the company collapses in 1774 is that about, I think, 100 of them have arrived at the company with bills of for £1 million each, which the company cannot pay. They dump their money in Bombay and they extract it in London, and they just don't have the funds in London to pay it. But it is a very, I mean, sociologically, it's a fascinating fact that these guys are out at 16. None of them join after 16. So their entire life is in the service of this. Their entire youth is in the service of this monstrous corporation.
This is an observation, not a question, by Mr. Jayesh Muge. He says, I'm halfway through Anarchy. I don't quite think I've come across anyone else talk about this topic more profoundly than Sir Dalrymple. Academics should try to include this in brief.
Thank you very much. I'm neither sir nor doctor, I'm afraid. I only got honorary doctors. I've never actually done my done the PhD that I should have done. So I'm very pleased to be promoted to Sir Dalrymple, but I'm not, I'm afraid.
This is to Dr. Goswami. Mr. Srinivas N says, please enlighten us on how Hindustani music and Kathak survived the obliteration of the Mughals.
I'm very sorry, I'm very poor as a listener and I couldn't get it.
He says, please enlighten us on how Hindustani music and Kathak survived the obliteration of the Mughals.
It's hardly relevant to what we've been talking about, but nor am I an expert in that area. But one thing is certain, that if these classical arts like music and dance survived, it is because the British took no interest in them. None whatsoever. The literary arts, I mean, the other arts and so on, they all got affected or inoculated or whatever it is and so on. But the performing arts survived essentially because they had no interest. If you read the accounts of, people who were traveling through India at that particular time, I'm talking about Europeans, English, and so on and so forth. And then they say they have very nice dinner, and then the nautch came on. I mean, then they die because it's going to go on for 2.5 hours or something like that. And then they just completely give up. I mean, they had no interest. No, not only knowledge, they had no interest in it.
They had a considerable interest in the dancing girls, but not because of the dancing, I think it's fair to say.
The other question, I mean, other people have digressed to discussing India and East Pakistan war, so we will leave them. If anyone has any questions, we have allowed participants to unmute themselves. You can directly ask. Winnell, I think there are no more questions.
Maybe people are hesitating about unmuting themselves, Usha.
No, I have actually allowed them to, I'm going to ask everyone to unmute.
And can we move to a gallery view, please, Usha? There's still screen sharing going on.
Yeah, okay. 1 second. One second, just give me a minute.
One was the wicket, the other one was a brilliant Yorker.
Does Mr. Dalrymple have to do that?
I think he can do that.
I think Mr. Dalrymple, if you would please stop the screen sharing so that we can go back to gallery view.
Yes, I can do that, I think. Stop share, here we go.
No, that's great. That's great. Okay. So anyone want to unmute themselves and speak up? Would anyone like to do that before we end the session?
May I ask a further question?
No, please go ahead. Yes.
You mentioned during your talk the effect of new technology or new strategic methods, strategic aspects of warfare. Now, do you have any comments regarding Tipu Sultan and his use of rockets in the, some of the Tipu wars?
Yes, I mean, I'm not a military historian, and my interest in this is very amateur, but it's fascinating. No, there's no question that the Tipu used rockets. Rockets had been used by many other individuals. It wasn't an innovation of Tipu, but Tipu used them with particular effectiveness, and it was then taken into the British Army system and known as the Congreve rocket system. So this was something which Tipu developed, which was became part of British military techniques. There were two other things that Tipu did, which the British copied. One was his use of flanking cavalry in infantry warfare. And this was shown at the Battle of Pollilore. Yet tomorrow, funny enough, at Sotheby's are putting on sale a wonderful panorama of the Battle of Pollilore, copied from Tipu's summer palace at Darya Daulat Bagh. And that victory was won less by, I think, the rockets, which were important, but were not mentioned in any of the sources. But the way that Tipu used cavalry in combination with infantry was something that the company admired. And the other thing he did was that he had an incredibly effective transport system. His bullock park was a thing that the company admired. And they, the same year that the company was defeated at Pollilore, they were also defeated by the Marathas in a small expedition which left Bombay to attack Pune. And the failure of the company was put down to the fact that they didn't have enough transport bullocks. Tipu had hundreds of thousands of transport bullocks. And when they defeated Tipu in 1799, the company absorbed Tipu's bullock park into their forces. And it was one of the reasons they were so effective against the Marathas 4 years later in 1803, was that they had basically Tipu's transport beasts, which they were able to deploy and use very effectively. I think one of the reasons for the Russian problems in the current Ukraine war, apparently, has been the fact that their transport lorries have been ambushed very effectively by the Ukrainians, leaving the tanks and the soldiers stranded at the front line because none of the transport. And this sort of thing was going on with the company and the Marathas until they got hold of, I think, this is from memory, it's a few years since I wrote this book now, I think it was 200,000 bullocks that Tipu had, and prime Mysore bullocks, those wonderful creatures that you see in Karnataka with those huge horns. So imagine 200,000 of those dragging cannon and artillery across India and moving supplies. And I think this was what Tipu, it's a less glamorous thing, but this was something that Tipu had mastered, the logistics of war, being able to move troops and food and artillery and ammunition very effectively and very speedily. Both times that Tipu defeated the British, it was the speed of his operations. He was like a German blitzkrieg in the Second World War. He moved down from Mysore down on the Carnatic with incredible speed and was able to support his troops with ammunition and food speedily enough to keep them supplied. And so less exciting than the Congreve rockets, but just as important. Remember the Duke of Wellington's famous phrase that an army marches on its stomach, and Tipu understood that very well and used that very effectively.
Any other
May I
questions?
ask a question, Winnell?
Yeah.
Just
go
a
ahead.
remark, maybe, because Mr. Dalrymple, you said several times that the East India Company succeeded in corrupting the British. But would that have been possible had the British already had a lack of intrinsic values and principles? I mean, unless they had. Is it possible to
They
corrupt
lack the moral backbone of Bharat. Well, I think certainly the 18th century was the famous age of corruption in Britain, and all those Hogarth cartoons of corrupt politicians and Gin Alley and the rotten boroughs and so on. So yes, I think it was a particularly corrupt and venal age. But that contrasted slightly with the 19th century when the British cleaned up their act, but it arguably became even more unpleasant, in that you move from that sort of swaggering 18th century to that hypocritical and utilitarian and evangelical tone in the 19th century, which is the famous incorruptibility of the civil service and so on, in such contrast to the corruption of the 18th century. So I don't think one can make generalizations about moral character of whole nations. I think you're in very tricky territory.
No, I'm saying the people he managed to corrupt, not the others.
But certainly, yes, I mean, the company was very effective at using money to buy politicians. And this thing, which is such a feature of modern politics anywhere in the world, where you have a democracy where politicians can be bought and the decisions of politicians can be influenced by political donations. If you have a democracy, it's often powered by donations. Why would you donate to a political party other than to project your interests? So the kind of thing that people attack the current government in this country for, saying that it's, for example, the Farmers' Bill is said to have been powered by the Adanis or Reliance and the Ambanis and so on. That kind of accusation is being made in the 18th century about company interests, the way that the company can buy the British Parliament in the 18th century.
Winnell, if I have your permission, can I?
Please, you go ahead, Vispy. This is our president.
Hello.
Vispy Valaporia. Go ahead, Vispy.
Yeah, thank you. So just my presidential intervention, if you wish, but I really just want to say how impressed, I'm sure we all are, with not just the breadth of your research, but the depth as well. And thank you for giving us an opportunity to hear you this evening. Just wanted to add my thanks to Winnell's and everybody else's, I'm sure.
Thank you, Vispy. I'm very grateful for that.
So I think let us wind up now, shall we?
Yeah,
If there are no more questions.
sure.
Yes, somebody wants to clap, and I'm sure everyone does. But well, I'll just to formally tie up ends. Anyway, I just want to say that it has been an immense privilege to hear such an erudite and vivid discussion by the author that has brought his book and his insights to life. And especially his what amazed us was his astonishing ability to find modern day equivalences. And I think that is what history is all about. So thank you for that, Mr. Dalrymple. It has been a treat for us to listen to you, especially since many of us have read your book. So it's really a treat to hear you speak.
Winnell, I'd like to apologize for being so slow in my communications. I know I was giving you kittens at various points.
No, that you did, but I will not speak about that here. But well, finally, you did come through for us, and so we are most grateful. We're most grateful. No, not everybody knows the long saga I had. I just keep saying it was not easy to entrap him, but he's with us finally.
I consider myself entrapped successfully there.
Wonderful. So, Professor Goswami, it is always a delight to hear your mellifluous voice.
Yeah.
Yes. And the depth of your discernment, your intuitive understanding of humankind has always enthralled us, as it has yet again today. And it was wonderful to listen to the poetry, the poets you quoted. So thank you, Ji. Thank you so much for chairing this session in the thoughtful way that is your wont, and for evoking a variety of emotions in this audience. So all in all, this has been a thrilling and a memorable evening. We look forward to future interactions with both of you at the Asiatic Society, and we invite all present to join us in the Darbar Hall, since we are now open. I do hope you will come and pay us a visit or give a small talk or whatever kind of interaction you are able to have with us. I thank all the participants here for the keen interest they have shown with their questions and views. It's wonderful to have such a packed virtual room. And as always, I thank our technical team, ably led by Professor Usha Vijayalakshmi, who has supported us these past 18 months, and joined today by Mr. Venkatesh, a most competent addition to the team. Once again, have a really good evening, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.